The aftermath of World War II saw the collapse of a once mighty industrial complex, Germany's underground factories, built to ensure the continuation of the war effort in the face of Allied bombings. These facilities, buried deep within the earth or hidden in the mountains, were designed to be impervious to aerial assaults and to safeguard the future of Nazi Germany's military production. When the war ended in May 1945, they were left to confront a new reality, a nation shattered, occupied, and defeated. The scale of these underground factories was immense. Hundreds of sites, spread across Germany and its occupied territories, had been constructed over several years, but many were never fully operational or had not reached their maximum potential. Their creation was a response to the relentless bombardment that had devastated German cities and manufacturing plants. Allied strategic bombing campaigns, particularly those targeting industrial hubs like the Ruhr Valley, forced the Nazis to look for alternatives. The result was the establishment of a vast subterranean industrial network, often hidden within the mountains of Bavaria, the Harz, and Thuringia, where the Allies' bombs could not reach. In the months following Germany's surrender, the Allied occupying forces, primarily the Americans, British, French, and Soviets, began the immense task of disassembling the war machine. Among the greatest challenges were the underground factories, which posed logistical, technical, and political issues. For the Allies, these sites were not just remnants of the war effort, they represented potential dangers. Much of the production capacity that had been relocated underground was still intact, and dismantling these facilities would become an important priority. At the same time, the political climate in Germany had shifted dramatically. The Nazi regime had collapsed, but the industrial infrastructure built during the war was vast and expensive to maintain. The Allies' primary objective was to prevent the resurgence of German militarism, and this meant ensuring that the nation's industrial base would not recover easily. This was compounded by the economic pressures that Germany faced in the aftermath of its defeat. The country was impoverished, its economy in ruins. The Allies imposed strict reparations and dismantling programs, which included the destruction or confiscation of military assets, including the remnants of these underground factories. In the first few months after the war, efforts to dismantle these sites were slow. The process was hampered by the sheer scale of the underground complexes. Many of the factories had been designed in such a way that disassembling them would require specialized equipment and considerable manpower. The tunnels and chambers, built for long-term production of armaments and aircraft, were difficult to navigate and often filled with debris. Some of the most ambitious facilities, like the complex at St. Georgen and the enormous subterranean factory at Nordhausen, remained partially intact or only partially dismantled by the time the war had ended. These sites, once thought to be fortresses, were now unremarkable shells in the ruins of a defeated empire. The initial Allied approach was pragmatic. The Americans, in particular, were focused on securing anything of value that could be used for their own benefit. The U.S. Army, as well as other Allied forces, began salvaging machinery, tools, and production equipment from the underground sites. Many of the engineers and workers who had been involved in the construction of the factories, or who had been forcibly conscripted into working on their operations, were put to work by the Allies to assist in the disassembly and transportation of valuable industrial resources. This operation, known as the Allied Reparations Program, was intended to deprive Germany of any remaining war-related production capacity, while also helping to rebuild the war-torn economies of the Allied powers. Despite the aggressive dismantling efforts, much of the machinery in the underground factories had little immediate use in the post-war world. The production lines had been geared toward weapons and military vehicles, many of which were now obsolete. The sheer volume of the machines and infrastructure was too great to simply destroy or transport, and many of the more specialized equipment pieces were left behind. This created a situation where, for a time, the underground factories became a symbol of wasted resources. In many areas, the vast tunnels and chambers sat unused, with only a skeleton crew of workers maintaining the bare minimum in the hope that these facilities could one day be repurposed for civilian purposes. Yet, repurposing the factories was not without its challenges. The deep tunnels, designed for secrecy and security, were not suitable for the production of consumer goods. The initial plan was to convert some of the factories into civilian industries, such as the production of automobiles or other essential goods. However, this was quickly found to be an impractical endeavor. In the post-war world, Germany's economy was severely restricted. The Allied occupation zones each had their own policies, and much of the industrial infrastructure in the Western zones was focused on rebuilding basic civilian life, not repurposing old war machines. The factories themselves were often located in areas that had been heavily bombed or had suffered from the collapse of nearby infrastructure. Transportation networks were in disarray, making it difficult to move any repurposed machinery to the necessary civilian sectors. Additionally, the political climate of the time was less concerned with industrial revival and more focused on denazification and preventing any sort of military resurgence. As such, the remnants of the underground factories became a burden rather than a resource. One notable case was the massive complex at Nordhausen, which housed a series of tunnels meant to produce jet aircraft engines. Despite efforts to salvage what was left, the site became a reminder of the futility of repurposing wartime infrastructure. The Allies were left with the task of securing and dismantling equipment that had been designed with a single purpose: to fuel the war machine of a now-defeated regime. By the end of 1945, the priority for the Allies was not repurposing but disposal. The machinery that could be salvaged was taken to various Allied nations, but much of the rest was scrapped. The gigantic production lines, once humming with the power of an industrial war effort, were reduced to rubble. Allied forces worked in teams to destroy or remove the more dangerous aspects of the facilities, like chemical plants and production sites for explosives or armaments. What was often left to decay, hidden deep within the mountains or buried under the weight of history. In Germany, the public was often unaware of the extent of the dismantling taking place. With much of the country in disarray, and most of its citizens focused on survival, the fate of these underground factories went largely unnoticed. The factories themselves, for the most part, ceased to be useful in any meaningful way. Their original purpose had been tied to the production of military equipment for a regime that no longer existed. What remained were the scars of a time that had passed. As the years progressed, the fate of these underground sites became less a matter of strategic importance and more a matter of historical curiosity. While some facilities were repurposed for civilian uses, many were abandoned entirely. With the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, much of the country's focus shifted to rebuilding cities and re-establishing the core of its industrial base. The underground factories remained largely forgotten, with only a few notable sites becoming tourist attractions or relics of the past. As the years passed, the underground factories of wartime Germany remained as haunting remnants of a forgotten war effort. While their initial fate was defined by the immediate post-war dismantling and the frantic efforts to remove any trace of Nazi military capability, their longer-term outcomes were more complex and varied. With the war's immediate aftermath marked by the monumental task of dismantling and reordering the remnants of the Nazi war machine, the abandoned factories were eventually overshadowed by the broader efforts to rebuild Germany and, in many cases, integrate these structures into the evolving Cold War dynamics. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the initial purpose of the underground factories had been eradicated. Their production lines, designed specifically to churn out weapons of war, had largely been destroyed or disassembled, their remnants often reduced to scrap metal. The machinery that had once been at the heart of an industrial war effort now stood as inert reminders of an era of devastation. In the Soviet occupation zone, many of the underground sites were abandoned outright, left to crumble in the remote mountain ranges. The East German authorities, focused on consolidating control and promoting industrial production aligned with Soviet-style central planning, had little use for these underground remnants. The cost of maintaining these sites was prohibitive, and most were left to rot, forsaken by both the people and the economy. In the West, however, the fate of these underground sites unfolded differently. As the Federal Republic of Germany took shape, the country faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding its industrial base. Much of the country's infrastructure had been destroyed during the war, and the economic focus shifted from military production to civilian industry. However, the legacy of wartime production, particularly in the West, was not easily discarded. The remnants of these underground facilities, scattered across the landscape, were not just symbols of a defeated past but also represented and used, albeit difficult to repurpose, infrastructure. In the early years of the Cold War, the Western Allies, particularly the United States, took a different approach to the industrial remnants of the war. Amid rising tensions with the Soviet Union and the desire to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against communism, the U.S. saw an opportunity to exploit what remained of Germany's war machinery. Many underground factories were eventually sold off or leased to private companies, especially in the booming post-war economy of West Germany. The factories, with their robust and durable structures, could potentially serve a new purpose: industrial production for civilian goods. However, the transition was never seamless. The equipment still largely remained unsuited to civilian industries, and the vast tunnels and chambers that once housed military production lines were awkwardly converted into facilities for things like car production or storage. For example, the vast complex at St. Georgian, once designed to produce the V-2 rockets that had terrorized London, was turned into a factory that produced consumer goods. The shift was not an easy one. The specialized equipment designed for weapons production was incompatible with civilian needs, and many factories were either repurposed for the production of less advanced technologies or left to stagnate. The machinery that had been salvaged often sat idle for years as companies struggled to adapt. Yet, the repurposing of some of these facilities did succeed in certain cases. One notable example was the conversion of the underground facilities in the Harz Mountains, which had been used for aircraft production during the war. After the war, these sites found new life in the burgeoning German automobile industry. The strong infrastructure built for wartime production was adapted for the manufacturing of civilian vehicles. The famed Volkswagen Company, for instance, repurposed some of these factories for the production of the iconic Beetle and other models. The strategic location of these sites, hidden in the mountains, also offered security against potential threats, which made them valuable assets in an era when political and military tensions were high. For many of the smaller, less well-known sites, the fate was far less optimistic. The maintenance of these underground factories, already an expensive undertaking, was no longer viable in the rapidly changing world of the 1950s and 1960s. As the economic focus shifted further toward consumer production, and as new technologies emerged, many of the facilities were decommissioned entirely. The tunnels and chambers that had once been filled with the sounds of heavy machinery and the production of advanced weaponry now stood silent, their once dominant purpose having evaporated. The cost of maintaining the facilities became an anchor, a drag on the economic recovery that had otherwise been progressing at a rapid pace. By the early 1960s, most of the factories that had been turned into civilian production facilities had ceased operation. Many of the once grand tunnels had been sealed off, their entrances lost to time. Some were completely forgotten, overgrown with vegetation and hidden beneath layers of history. The legacy of the underground factories was one of industrial waste, a vast network of infrastructure that could not be reimagined or repurposed in the way its creators had hoped. The few remaining facilities that survived into the late 20th century were either kept as historical sites or sold to private collectors. In some cases, these underground complexes were turned into museums, where the remains of wartime machinery and documentation of their original purpose were displayed to a new generation. Some of the sites became part of the industrial history of post-war Germany, with a focus on their role in the war rather than any lasting impact on the country's later recovery. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these underground factories is the way they embody the unrelenting pressure of wartime production and the eventual waste that resulted from it. The Germans had gone to great lengths to protect their industrial base, and in doing so, had created a vast and complex network of facilities designed to endure the ravages of war. Yet, in the end, these efforts proved futile. The factories were abandoned, repurposed, or scrapped, and their legacy was subsumed by the economic and political realities of the post-war world. For many, the underground factories represent the ultimate paradox of World War II. The effort to build something that would ensure survival ultimately led to the creation of infrastructure that, in the aftermath, could not survive. What was once seen as a crucial effort to sustain the Nazi war machine became, In the end, an expensive, impractical, and ultimately useless relic of a past that had been destroyed. The sheer scale of the endeavor was staggering: vast networks of tunnels and production lines, all built with the idea of prolonging a war that was already lost. The fate of these underground factories is also a testament to the overwhelming power of the post-war economic and political realities. Germany, once the engine of European industry, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The underground factories, while massive in scale, were a burden that could not be carried into the future. Their failure to be repurposed or preserved speaks to the enormous challenges faced by Germany and the Allied powers in the aftermath of the war. While many of the post-war efforts to dismantle the German industrial base were driven by the desire to prevent further military production, the industrial legacy of the war proved to be both too much and too little, a vast, costly system that was impossible to maintain, and ultimately irrelevant in the rebuilding of a nation that had been torn apart. In the end, the underground factories faded from the collective memory. Their existence became a shadow of history, remembered only by a few who had seen them in their prime or had witnessed the collapse of their wartime purpose. Today, what remains are the faint echoes of a bygone era, hidden in the forgotten corners of Germany's landscape. The factories are no longer symbols of a nation's might but of its fall, a reminder of the futility of war and the unpredictable course of history.